the number of ways we can do this, but again, I'll use this local database just as an example of how to do this, just because it's easier to demo it this way. But in reality, you'd probably be doing this with a remote database like this MySQL database. The process is identical, so it doesn't matter whether we're using a local or a remote database. The process is the same. So I'll use the local database to demonstrate this. And the way I'm going to do this is by going through and deleting all of the entities that we've been using. When you delete them, there's an option here not to delete the underlying artifacts in the database. So what this is going to do is to remove the entity from Instant JChem, but leave the table and everything related to the table in the database. And we'll do that for all of these tables. And this will simulate the situation. Oh, I just deleted the table by mistake. What I'll do in this case, I'll just create a new project. This will be the easier way of doing this. I'll create a new project with the demo data. It'll keep it nice and simple. And now with this new project, I'll go through, delete the entities, but leave everything in the database. Okay, so now I'm at the situation that sort of simulates the position that if I connected Instant JChem to that database for the very first time, there are tables in there. There could potentially be views as well, but in this case they're not. But at the moment, Instant JChem knows nothing about those tables and can't use them. So what's the process here of allowing Instant JChem to know about these tables and to start and to be able to start using the data in them? Well, the process is to promote the table to an entity. Promote is the term we use in Instant JChem to that indicate you're making Instant JChem aware of that table. And what we're doing is we're promoting that table, the wombat table in the database, to an entity in Instant JChem that can now be used. By default, we give it the same name as the table, and there are a few properties you might want to define, such as the whether empty structures are allowed and things like that. And then on the next step, it looks at the columns in the table and asks you which ones you want to be accessible to Instant JChem as fields. And by default, it hides the things like the fingerprint columns because those are really of no interest to the user. It shows you all the extra columns that contain data that might be of interest to you. So the internal columns that are used by JChem are hidden, but the ones that contain useful information, like the structure or any additional columns that that are present, are promoted to fields. So we've now promoted that table, and it's now available as an entity. We can also do the same for the other tables in the database. So we'll promote the PubChem table. The process is the same. We select the properties, we select the columns we want to see. We can promote the activities table. Again, the process is much the same, but for a plain data table, you don't have all the chemical fingerprint columns and things like that. But other than that, the process is the same. We can, at any stage, change parameters for the fields and things like the name, but generally you don't need to. And for the other tables, what have we got? We've got the keyword. Yeah, this is the keyword table. Hang on, which table have we got here? Well, we actually don't need the keyword to actually do to illustrate what we're doing here. So we've got three tables which are now entities. The PubChem demo, which is a standalone data set all in a single table, and the wombat structures and the wombat activities, which contain the biological activities for the structures and there's a foreign key constraint in the database between those two tables. So we can immediately go and view the data in those tables. There's the data from the Wombat table. There's the data from the PubChem table. And there's the data from the Wombat assay table. These are currently independent tables, and there's no relationship between the tables. But we know there is actually a relationship between the Wombat structure table and the Wombat activity table. So let's go and see how you can make Instant JChem aware of that. We saw earlier how you can create a relationship from scratch. In this case, we don't need to create it from scratch because there's a foreign key constraint in the database that we're going to use. So we're going to create the relationship from that foreign key constraint. And it reads the information about the foreign key constraint and makes the settings as best it can. You have to do a few things. You have to tell it whether you want it to be a one-to-one or a many-to-one relationship. You need to give it a name for the relationship. Activities to structures. And the relationship, the foreign key constraint itself defines the source table and the target table and the fields to use for the relationship. So there's not much you have to define here. And now we've added that relationship, and we've got the you can see it here as the relationship here between the activities and the structures table. Now with that relationship, the process from now on is exactly the same as we did before. We would go to the Wombat data tree, you would add a new edge based on that relationship we've just added, and then you could go to the Wombat, you create a new view for that, and create a new empty form, and now go and start designing our form just as we did before, put the structure on it, put some fields from the structure table, and put a table there containing the activity data. This time there are lots of fields here. Let's assume we don't want all of them. We'll just pick some of the particular fields. Type, target name, target type, value. And when we go to browse mode, we now see our data. So here again, in a fairly simple process, we went from the process of having tables that were in the database, but Instant JChem was not aware of them. We promoted them to entities. We created relationships between those tables. In this case, we did it using a foreign key constraint that was in the database, but you could create the relationship from scratch, creating the foreign key constraint, or you could just create the relationship and completely ignore the foreign key constraint. And then with that relationship, we assembled the data tree to use that relationship, and then with the data tree in hand, we created a form that now uses that relationship in this master detail arrangement. So that's the basics of using the schema editor. I just want to go back and stress the usefulness of being able to import these tables into Instant JChem by this process of promotion, and stress that you're not limited to data that is just loaded in directly through Instant JChem, either manually row by row or imported in. Very often your data files might be more complex or more bizarre than Instant JChem can cope with by default. So you can't import it in directly using Instant JChem, but there's nothing to stop you going in and importing it directly into the database using some program you've written, or Pipeline Pilot, or any other tool that's appropriate, putting the data into the database, and then using Instant JChem to view that data. So that's the summary of the database building capabilities in Instant JChem.